Good to see you. I invite you to turn to Exodus 23 this morning as we continue on in our study of Exodus. We'll be talking about Sabbath laws. Yes. All right. Okay. One of you. Sabbath laws. We're going to talk about how this theme of Sabbath is a very important theme throughout Scripture and very much so in our lives today. So, just as a catch up, if you're new or if you have missed a couple weeks or you were here but you weren't here, we are following Israel as they have been rescued out of Egypt from slavery. And now they are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Moses is receiving the law, and they're going to be camped out at Mount Sinai for about a year. And after that, spoiler alert, they're going to wander around in the wilderness for quite some time. And so we are waiting for them to go into the promised land, but they're not there yet. And so we're here, and the people of God are being formed. And as that's happening, there's this series of laws that are being given. And so if you did the homework last week, as Eric invited you to read chapters like 20 through 23, there's a lot of laws that were given. And so we come to the end of this chunk spanning the last few chapters, and the Sabbath laws come in this moment. And they are important to Israel, they're important to us. And so here's just how we're going to talk about them. We're going to just go through the text that was already read for us, and Connie did a great job. And Connie's not, I thought, well, there you go. She's not in second service either. Well, I'm going to write that down. Okay. She did a great job reading it. I'm just going to read the sections and break it up for us as we go as well, just so it's fresh in our minds. But the outline for us this morning is we're going to talk about yearly rest for Israel and then weekly rest. And then we're going to close with this pattern of a lifetime of rest, what it meant at the beginning of creation and how that impacts us today. And all throughout that, we'll have this idea that we'll just think about that how we live our lives shows very much who we live for. And not in a legalistic sense, but how we establish, how we function, how we live. It shows who we live for. So let's just read again verses 10 through 11 of Exodus 23, and then we'll talk about it. So God is speaking to Moses here. He says, "For 6 years you're to sow your fields and harvest the crops. But during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove." And so as we start the passage this morning, we see this first look at this cycle of the Sabbath, that there is definitely a pattern of work, yes, but also in that a pattern of rest that's being established. But Israel's to work the land. They're to sow, to harvest, to subdue, to rule. They're to produce and make. And all of this language, it should be drawing us back, yeah? It's drawing us back to the opening pages of Scripture. And so we go in and we get into Genesis chapter 1, and we're invited into this story of how God begins to create the world. And as he does it, the author's so clear at how well God is doing. Every time God creates, it is good, right? It's not just okay, it is good. And then there's a climax of it being very good. And my wife and I, if you've ever been to our house, we used to have this massive 80-foot by 20 feet by taller than me section of junipers. Ugh, the worst. So we had someone come out and rip them out, which was awesome in one sense. Now it's like, oh, hey, everybody, there you are. But it's still, overall, I'd say it's pretty good. But we're looking, it's just a bunch of dirt now, and so we need to put something in there. So we're looking at doing these blocks. Has anyone got blocks at their house? Yep. Wow, who knew that those could cost so much? So this guy comes out and gives us a bid, and I was like, interesting. Okay, do you make like a grade B type of block, maybe something that most people wouldn't put in their yard, but I would, and it's cheaper? And without skipping a beat, he said, "We don't do grade B blocks." And I thought, all right, well, I don't do that first quote you gave me. So, but the point I'm making, when God creates, it is good. There is no second rate. There is no other option. God is the creator of and the definer of what good is. And so he begins to create this good world. And then he creates mankind as well. And what is humanity called to do? Do you remember? Towards the end of, yeah, Patty, I saw you say it. The end of Genesis chapter 1. You can turn there if you want. But they're called to rule. And they're to rule over what God has created. There's this order as God establishes things, that humanity is to rule. It's humanity over creation as they partner with God in this task. And God creates in his image, male and female, he created them, and they're to rule and work the land. And this isn't a one-time deal. This is a process that's supposed to keep going as these newly appointed partners begin this task. And so it says in Genesis 1, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth, and subdue it. And in that last verse, another call comes in to rule. And so humanity, they're not just supposed to rule animals. There's this established order if we were to go read it, but they're not just over animals. What else is under humanity's care? Do you remember? Just off the top of your head? I mean, Les was here first service, so not to call you out. But yes, everything is under their care. There's the ground, there's the trees, there's the plants. All of creation is to be under the care of humanity. This garden is to be stewarded by Adam and Eve in its entirety. And again, it's this call. It's not just okay. This task of working the land is very good. And then the author has this interesting note at the end of Genesis chapter 1. He says, and there was evening, and there was morning the sixth day. And there's this pattern that begins to come out, begins to be established, to work the land, that it's a gift to do so, but it's not all that Israel is called to do. They're also called to rest. And so in our passage this morning, you'll notice that Israel is to also care for the people that are around them, but not just the people. They're to care for creatures too. And it's not just simply this one group that should rest, but the land is to rest as well. Is that interesting? That the land is to lie unplowed and unused. You're to harvest and sow all the time, every year. The calendar of the Jewish people will circle around these three main festivals. It's important to them, but on the seventh year, you're not to do that. Why? Why is Israel not to harvest in that seventh year? Oh, that didn't work. Yeah, they're to rest, and they're not alone. They live among a people. And our individual love of God, we know it's individual, it's foundational that each of us puts faith in God. But there's a second commandment that's very similar to loving God with everything that you've got, which is love of neighbor. There you go. Love your neighbor as yourself. We're not isolated alone, but instead we're called to do life together. And these people that are around Israel, you're to let them use your land, to eat the fruit, the food that comes off of that. And so these themes that are being established, they're going to carry through. It's not just right here in Exodus 23, but if you keep reading, if you go into the Levitical law, which we love to do, Exodus 19, you'll hit the series of laws, and in those is, again, more laws on the Sabbath. It's this call for humanity to be mindful of the poor among you, that these laws are to be actual marks of God's people. As they go into these places, living among a people, that these would be very clear distinguishers, that they do life very differently. And the God that they worship and serve is different than the other gods in the neighboring places that they will go. And in fact, we're introduced, if we keep reading into the history of Israel, we're introduced to a very important person in the line of David, not that far removed from David. And then later, Jesus himself, if this is saying it the right way, will benefit from this law found in Exodus and later repeated in Leviticus. And so the author introduces us to a poor young widow who is also a foreigner, oftentimes not even mentioned by her name. She is mentioned by the place that she has come. And she moves, not with her own family, but with her mother-in-law. After she's lost everything, she moves to Bethlehem, to this new land. And because of this law that we just found out about, that we were talking about in Leviticus, and this complete provision of God, you know what I'm talking about? Right? Ruth, right? Ruth and Naomi show up on the scene. And they just so happen to meet this guy named Boaz, and it just so happens to be the time of harvest, and he just so happens to be their kinsman redeemer. This is the language of Ruth. Like, can you believe that this just keeps happening, right? And so we meet this couple in this call in Exodus 23. It takes us back and reminds us, it reminds Israel to refresh the people around you. Care for them. And be intentional with the care that you give them. Don't be flippant with it. Don't be absent-minded about it, but set out to be a blessing in the community where you live. Can you imagine if that was our goal today? Oh man, I'd share my coupons with you guys probably. Maybe. The Subway ones, right? People, animals, trees, all of this is being formed. And the ground is something, just because the Talbots aren't here anymore, I can talk about orcharding, but the ground is very important. You think about that, like the work that you would do year after year to reap a harvest. But the trees are mentioned also. It's a little odd, but these trees are mentioned as well. And I think there's at least a danger. You know, if it was me planting these trees, if I did all that work at the beginning, I've never planted a tree, but to imagine if I did. And you do all that work to plant it, to work it, to shape it, to do whatever else you do with trees, and then you go, well, that clearly, everything that comes out of the work that I have put forward, that's mine. It only makes sense that I would reap the benefit, the fruit of my labor. But not in the seventh year, God says. That is to go to the people that you live among, the poor people around you, and not just the people. There's this fascinating ping pong of the land and people and animals as well, but it's to go to animals as well. And why are animals mentioned at all? Multiple times. I said this first service. I'm pretty sure no one told me any different after first service, but I don't think ancient Israel was like knitting sweaters for their animals and walking around with them in the morning like we do now. So someone just looked at someone like, that's what you do. Wow, that was awesome. Okay, so if that's not the practice, then why are animals mentioned at all? Well, because God cares about the whole of his creation, doesn't he? Not just one part of it. He cares about the entirety of it, and all of it finds its blessing through the Sabbath. It's beautiful. God cares for everything, and our understanding of that as we continue to read forward in the biblical text, it shapes it. It shapes how we come to the end of Scripture as well. It's very, very beautiful. As the temple's established, as they form around and begin to worship God, all of these themes will come into play. And so there's this message that how you live your life, it matters. It shows who you live for. And so that's big picture. You think about 7 years, right? Okay, one day we're going to do that 7 years from now. And you go, that's fine. It's easy. This is me, maybe not you, but it's easy to put a plan to paper, yeah? You're just like, oh, yeah, 7 years from now? Anyone asked you, like, your 5-year plans? Man, I can come up with those, like, anytime. Well, let me tell you. Glad you asked, right? And I'm just banking on the fact, like, I'm not going to see you in 5 years, you know? So how is Israel going to do this actually 7 years from now? As this law is being taken down to stone, what are they going to do? How is it going to take root in the hearts of everyday people? Not just Moses, not just Aaron, but everybody. How's it going to take root in their lives? And then comes the rhythm of practicing it every week. That's how you're going to know. You're going to do it every week. Look at verse 12. It says, 6 days do your work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. And so just in case we thought we were ready to get rid of work altogether, don't miss this important call of Israel to work. It's this beautiful gift. It's part of the original design. Work shows up actually before Genesis 3. It doesn't come after the curse. It's there in chapter 2. It's just it gets harder, more frustrating, and apparently more sweaty after chapter 3. But it's probably when junipers were created. Maybe not. But it's a gift to work the land. And they're called to do it. But how much is a good question. How much? And at what cost are we willing to work? And this can hit home for some of us. Some people will say, if you want to achieve greatness at the highest levels of success, then you just got to work nonstop. And we look at people in our lives or in our culture, and we look at them maybe as extreme, but at least successful, And I was, this last weekend, I was watching a movie, speaking of work, and it was a movie about Steve Jobs. And man, all that guy did all the time was work. And he did some stuff with computers as well. But anyway, but the movie goes on to say, and there's this very critical moment at the end. You've been walking through his life, seeing all of these achievements. And someone calls him out and he says, but you sacrificed relationship. And in particular, it shows this relationship that he had with his daughter, how he really didn't have a relationship with her. And some will just say, well, that's the price of doing something great. Okay, but here, something is introduced to us that is different. Work, absolutely, but here comes this very foundational rhythm, and it's rest. 6 days, do your work. Don't slack off. Like, there's plenty to be read on that. But on the seventh day, you're called to rest. Why? I just needed a break. It's important to trust God. It's important to give more than a mental nod of assent that he's the one who's in control. And to recognize deep down that he is our provider. He is not an add-on. He's not a Hail Mary pass at the end when things blow up in our faces. He is our primary source of provision. Chasing our own gain and security apart from God is foolishness, the biblical authors will say. Don't do it. And we see earlier, a few chapters earlier, when the people of Israel are being provided for. They've just left, Egypt, and they're complaining. We had leaks. I've never had a leak to my memory. Apparently they're pretty good when you've been in the wilderness for a while, but they're complaining about, the food that they don't have. And what does God give them? Man, I thought second service was more on top of it. Yeah, okay, that's all right. You can just say it. Manna, right? Which means, what is it? And he gives it to them, but he has instructions with it because he wants them to know that he cares for them, that he will provide. So he says, only get enough for that day. Except on the Sabbath, you can get a double portion then. And what's the next thing you read? It's people like getting a bunch of it, and then they wake up the next day and they're like, this is bad now. It's like rotten. Or there's people on the Sabbath, and what are they doing? They're not putting their attention on the one who has cared for them. They're looking for manna, and I would love to be the one who got manna in the tent, be like, look at this guy, kids, right? Be like, no, he says there's a clear pattern of trusting in God for his provision. And before the Sabbath, this climactic moment, he will provide a double portion. And so while Israel is lost and looking for what they think is going to sustain them or fill their bellies, and to feed their families, God says, no, if you would trust me, then you'll find the very thing that brings you life. Not just food, but communion with me and rest on the Sabbath. So there's this awesome process of cultivating and ruling and establishing, but in that is a clear call to rest. Over and over again, it's not just the top of the chain, but it's all the way down. And here come the animals again. All the way down to the ox and donkey. And so if animals are not outside God's rest, then what about people? And did you notice who the rest extends to as far as people go? Yeah, everybody. I mean, there is no one that is left out. All work stops. And if you've become a slave for whatever reason, and if you want context on that, just go back and listen to last week's sermon. But there is no one who's left out. There is no one who is marginalized. There is no cog in the wheel that keeps the line moving forward while just one class goes to observe the Sabbath. Work is to stop, and God's people are to rest. It's unheard of. And they're going into all of these foreign lands who have all of these systems of how they do life and worship and all of this. And imagine this group who rolls in, and they've got foreigners. There are people in slavery, and they come, and they're working. They look fairly normal. And then the seventh day comes, and there's nothing going on. It's incredible. It's absolutely fascinating. And there's a huge reminder that God continually brings up to them. Why should you rest? Why should you not let it carry down to the foreigner or the slave born in your home? Because you know what it's like to be worked ruthlessly. You know what it's like to have no say in the matter, to have demands made of your life. You know what it's like to be slaves in Egypt. And so in Exodus 22, God says, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you are foreigners in Egypt. And then just earlier in our chapter, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. So why is this history important to Israel? It comes up again at the end of verse 12. The foreigner living among you. Why should they rest? So that even the foreigner living among you can be refreshed. And the provision of God that's being made at the outset of all of this is incredible. Even here, there are outsiders coming in to the community of faith. And it works really well, doesn't it? Like, as long as Israel is like staying on track and doing all of this, it goes really, really well. But we know what's coming for them. We know that abandonment of the law, turning away from God, the worshiping of false God, all of this is in their future, but it's not right now. At the foot of Mount Sinai, at least for a little bit longer, we're okay. All right. So that's the history of Israel, all right? Who cares? That's a question that we should ask. Okay, we just read this, ancient Israel, chapter 23. Wes has been talking for I don't know how many minutes. Who actually cares? How serious that the Israelites took their call to work, and also how serious they took their call to rest. And this is where the biblical patterns begin to come out. And so if you come to the end, did anyone notice in verse 13 it just reads a little odd? Did anyone feel like verse 13 read a little odd? It's like this nice pattern of Sabbath rest and Sabbath rest. Verse 13, be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. You go, is this just one more religious add-on? Like, oh, tell them about idolatry. It's real bad. Don't do that. Stay away from it, right? Then we come into the crux of it all, and we begin to be drawn into this idea of a lifetime of rest and what it meant for God to rest. I was telling, as we're gathering together on Wednesday, this past Wednesday, I was just saying, I was reminded again this last week of how important the themes that are developed in chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Genesis are. That they are foundational to our understanding of the sweep of the biblical narrative. So we learn all kinds of things. We learn about God, we learn about